we should wait a few more minutes? Oh, do you think we should wait?
No. Good morning, everybody. It's 8:35, and we are going to formally end at 9:30, so we want to be respectful of everyone's schedules and get started. My name is Wade Thompson. I'm a partner here at Jenner & Block. More importantly, I've been on the leadership board for many years at the National Immigrant Justice Center, and I've represented children coming from Central America in their efforts to get through our asylum system. So, like many of you out here, this is an issue very near and dear to me. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Mary Meg McCarthy, Executive Director of NIJC, will do the introductions and so forth, but I really think everyone's here to get something done, so let's get right to it. And also, in the name of being efficient today, our format is that the three real experts are going to talk kind of where we are and steps forward, and then we'll finish with kind of Q&A towards the end for about 15 minutes. We will end right at 9:30, so people that need to get on to what they got to do can go ahead, but I encourage people that still want to talk. There's a lot of good people from a lot of different areas here today to stick around, coordinate, coalesce, and get things moving. It really is great to see so many people here today. We have many representatives from offices of elected officials, many members of the business community, including some firm clients, and also many pro bono attorneys and attorneys at work in the trenches day to day on immigration matters. So I thank you all for all your hard work outside of this meeting today, and I thank you for coming. So without further ado, Mary Meg McCarthy.
Thank you, Wade, and thank you very much to you and the firm for hosting this briefing. We received many calls over the past couple of months, and we thought this would be a great opportunity to pull people together to talk about what we're seeing and the reality, both locally as well as nationally. And I was very fortunate to be able to go to Lackland Air Force Base, which was one of the first emergency shelters created for this influx of children, with one of our colleagues, Dwayne Segal, who's also a member of the leadership board of NIJC. And what we saw there were over 1,000 children between the ages of 12 to 14, all in immigration proceedings, from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, the majority from Honduras. All of these children traveled alone, journeyed alone, but in our conversations with them, were fleeing terrible, terrible situations. Another colleague, Royce Murray, some of you may know, she works in our D.C. office, traveled to Artesia, New Mexico last week, where we have Central American families with their children, primarily women and their children, or mothers and children, I should say. The median age there is 6 years old. Again, these are individuals who are fleeing violence and harm in their home country. Prior to this time, we maybe had less than 100 beds for family detention. In Artesia, New Mexico, we have over 600 beds. In this influx, we are seeing not only a refugee crisis, but more importantly, a due process crisis. And we are really fortunate to have Trini Sanchez here with us today to talk about why this is a refugee crisis. This is not a trend or an issue that caught us by surprise. Over the past couple of years, we've seen an increasing number of children and adult asylum seekers from Central America. But unfortunately, now when we see this increase of people accessing protection under our law, we panic. And we've seen the rollback of due process protections and an increase in detention. 50,000 kids is small compared to the hundreds of thousands of children and families from Syria who are fleeing protection and traveling to Jordan. The government cannot use this influx to curtail due process protections for adults and children. We need to make sure that our laws that provide protection are being properly implemented. And we're happy to say that with people like you, we've made some advancement, but there's a lot more to do. So I'd like to now introduce Trinidad Sanchez, who just came back from Central America on Sunday. And he's going to talk to us about the root causes in the dissolution of civil society in Central America and share with us what he's seeing there and why we call this a refugee crisis. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for organizing this conversation, this sharing of information. Yes, I returned from Honduras last Sunday, where my family is, my mother and brothers and sisters are still there. And I was talking at the beginning with Mary Meg and Webb and others in here that people feel like prisoners in the city of San Pedro Sula, where my brother is. He lives in a neighborhood called Satélite, and there is another neighborhood there called La Pradera. And during May, there was a massive killing of children over there. Well, the press reported about 13, but people say that there were more children killed in 2 weeks in those neighborhoods. And the reason they were killed, those children, the children from 6 years to 14 years, because the Mara, we call Mara is the gang 13 and the gang 18 are fighting territory there in San Pedro Sula in the neighborhoods. So they are those two drug organizations. They are trying to gain territory and convince children to get involved with them, and then children refuse, and they kill them. And there was one case, one mother that her child was killed in one of the soccer camps in there, and then there was another message that the mother was going to kill the oldest boy. So she flew the same night that she received the message. She left San Pedro Sula and came to Mexico. I don't know where she's now. But those are the cases. People are terrified about the situation of violence in there. But that's, I would say, I don't say you have the saying here, the iceberg, that what we see, what we see are those things of the maras, but there are other things under the thing that you can see. I think one big factor is the state of impunity in Honduras. The failure of law, the failure of the judicial system. I think that's one of the bases of this basic problem. The government hasn't been able in the last 4 years to establish a good judicial system and to clean it. All of you know that 2009 we had a coup d'etat in Honduras, and since the coup d'etat, 68 lawyers have been killed. Lawyers have been following cases, trying to investigate and to prosecute cases. They have been killed. Only 4 of those 68 have been prosecuted, have been investigated. 4 cases of lawyers have been killed from 68. And that's the news today. I read the newspaper today. It's called the Heraldo. That news is today. It says 68 lawyers have been killed in the last 2 years, and only 4 have been investigated those cases. This is today. You want to go to see heraldo.com, today's that news. But 37 journalists have been killed. And probably there is 2 of those, I'm not sure about the number, but probably only 2 have been investigated those cases. About 37 journalists have been killed. More than 100 farmer leaders from the northern coast of Colaguan, they're in land, recovering land, they have been killed also in these last 4 years now. And then a lot of violence in the street, and there is no law, there is not a judicial system. My own cousin, Johnny, in 2010, he was killed in a prison in Comayagua, where 360 prisoners died. You remember that? Killed in a fire. My cousin was there because he was a taxi driver and was looking for a job, and somebody gave him a taxi. And then the police arrested him, saying that the taxi had been stolen for somebody else, and he didn't know about that. He went to prison, and without judicial prosecution, after a year, he died in the prison in Comayagua in a fire where 360 other prisoners died. So there is a lot of proof that the judicial system is not working. So I think it's a mixture, when we talk about the reasons, it's a mixture about the judicial system failures, it's about the culture of violence, but also there is the poverty, the extreme poverty that it has been increased in the last, I would say, 10, 15 years in Central America. I grew up in a community called San Jose, and we didn't have hot water in there, we didn't have TVs, we didn't have cars, we didn't have fancy things, but we were happy. We were very happy in those communities. When I grew up, I only had 6th grade school in there. We didn't have, of course, a lot of limitations in there. But families were happy because they had their piece of land and they had food to eat. And people were healthy because they had their subsistence form of living. They had their way of living. What happened is 20 years now, all the way of living of people in there have been destroyed. You know why? Another community, I'm in San Jose, we're corn farmers, but another community called Otoro, they were rice farmers. There were 20 co-ops of rice farmers. And at the beginning of the 90s, the government did this treatment with the United States called free trade agreements, where big corporations from the States and send rice to Honduras. And the cheap rice came to Honduras and killed all the prices of the local products in there. So all those 20 co-ops, sons, daughters, fathers, mothers sometimes, they are here in the States now. Because the rice that went from here to Central America is a half price because it's subsidized. It's a subsidized product. And the rice over there didn't have a market. All those people are here. The same happened with the corn, with the beans, with all the local products, because we are now importing our own food. One thing last week, our base of food there is corn and beans. You know that. Rice, corn, and beans is the basic. People can be, it might be that they don't have meat, they don't have other thing, but if they have corn and beans, they are happy. And that's the way I grew up, and we were fine. But now we don't find corn and beans produced in Honduras because it's imported from California. And now it's imported from Ethiopia, Africa. So I think that's one of the key elements why the crisis. Honduras is a very rich country, has a lot mines, minerals, has a lot of coast in the northern and also in the Pacific coast. We have coast in the Pacific and the north. We have a lot of mountains, rivers, water, a lot. But you will wonder why it's still poor. I think it's economic system that concentrate wealth in a few hands and don't distribute the wealth. That's the basic line of this migration crisis that we are living now. So those were my talking points. Thank you. Sure.
My name is Ashley Hebner. I'm a managing attorney at NIJC, and I specifically manage our Immigrant Children's Protection Project and our Asylum Project. And for the past year or so, but particularly the past few months, we've both been inundated with children, families, and adults from Central America who are seeking asylum. I think one thing that we find it important to note is although the issue of the children crossing the border right now is on everyone's mind, and for very good reason, the numbers of families and adults who are coming from Central America and seeking asylum has also increased, and there's a huge need for representation and assistance for them as well. So what I'm going to talk about very briefly today is what happens when these individuals that Mary Megan and Wade and Trini talked about come to the U.S. border, specifically what happens to the children. So under our current law right now, when immigrant children reach the border, there's a two-part process depending on the country that they're from. And what's important to note is that the majority of the children who are coming to the border right now are actually turning themselves into Border Patrol. So this isn't a situation in which children are trying to evade apprehension in any way. Most of the children are actually turning themselves into Border Patrol when they reach the border. The difference at that point depends on whether the child is from, assuming the child is unaccompanied, meaning not with a parent or legal guardian at the time. The difference is whether the child is from a contiguous country or a non-contiguous country. Under our current law, that's how the children are treated and how they're differentiated. So if a child is from Mexico and is apprehended at the border, that child can be immediately repatriated so long as it's determined that the child is not or will not be a victim of trafficking, does not have a fear of persecution and asylum claim in their home country, and agrees to voluntarily return to Mexico. So when we talk about the numbers of the children who are being apprehended at the border and the thousands of children who have come into the United States this year, that is not even including any of the Mexican children who have been crossing the border. So most of the Mexican children are simply turned around and they never actually come into the United States and are able to access our asylum process and other protections here. For non-Mexican children, and primarily we're talking about children from Central America who are unaccompanied, when they reach the border, the law requires that the Customs and Border Protection turn them over to the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is part of the Department of Health and Human Services, within 72 hours. As you may have seen in the news, that's not what is currently happening. For the most part, the children that we've been seeing coming through in the past months are often in Customs and Border Patrol custody in these short-term holding facilities, which are not meant for children and are not meant for long-term custody for 1, 2, or 3 weeks. These are the pictures that you've seen often in the news of hundreds of children shoved into very small spaces, sleeping on concrete floors, and being covered with those aluminum blankets. NIJC and several other organizations back in June filed a mass complaint against the treatment of many of these children, 116 children who had been abused and mistreated while in CBP custody. And while this situation has definitely been exacerbated by the number of children crossing the border, it's a situation with CBP that has been occurring for many, many years. And so we are and have been extremely concerned about the length of time that children are being kept in CBP custody, which is in violation of the law and clearly not in the best interest of the children. Once children are transferred to the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, they are sent to shelters throughout the United States. It's important to note that the placement of children in a particular ORR contracted shelter is in no way connected to the place where the children will likely be released once they reunify with a family member. So as an example, here in the Chicagoland area, there are 9 shelters, about 500 beds, and NIJC provides legal services to the children in these shelters. The majority of these children, however, however, are not released to family here in Illinois. They are released to family in Tennessee, in Louisiana, and New York, and Virginia, and California, and Florida. So most of the children that come through here do not stay here. Under the law, children have to be held in the least restrictive setting possible once they get transferred to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. And so what we typically see is children are detained for very short periods of time. Close to half of the children coming through Chicago right now only stay here for 3 weeks or less. Many of the children we actually see being released to family in 3 to 5 days, so a very short period of time. And although it's wonderful that children can be reunited with family so quickly, it does create certain concerns about their treatment, about their best interest, and about their ability to access certain legal services. And I'll talk about that in a second. So when children cross the border and they are taken into the custody of Customs and Border Protection, they also immediately receive a notice to appear, which is the charging document that will place them in immigration court proceedings. So basically, the minute the children come into the United States, even though they are unaccompanied and they do not speak English for the most part, and they do not have an attorney, nor are they allowed to have an attorney appointed to them at government expense, they are immediately placed in removal proceedings, and the government begins the process of trying to actively deport them from the United States. So what happens when the children reach these ORR shelters, and one of the most important services they receive while they are in these ORR shelters is basic legal services. So ORR contracts out to legal service providers like NIJC throughout the United States to provide basic legal services to children while they are held in ORR custody. This primarily includes Know Your Rights presentations and individual legal screenings. So the Know Your Rights presentations are intended to provide the children with basic information regarding their legal rights and responsibilities here in the United States and with regards to the immigration court system. This is incredibly important because we believe that a significant number of children, once they are released, are never actually able to access legal services again. Keep in mind, again, that these children do not have the right to appointed counsel, and many children are being released to non-metropolitan areas, states where there are not many immigration legal services, much less low-income or pro bono legal services. And to the extent they are released into metropolitan areas, for example, New York or Miami, that may have more resources, they're completely inundated, and there are not enough legal services available to provide representation for these children. So it's incredibly important when these children are in ORR custody that they receive that basic information to understand that when they are released from the shelters, their immigration court case continues. They have to go to immigration court if they want to pursue the relief that they may be eligible for. If they don't go to immigration court, they will be ordered removed. They are responsible for notifying the court once they're released from custody that their address has changed and potentially to change their venue if they move anywhere so that they're not stuck having to come to court in Chicago when they're living in Miami. So it's incredibly important that children receive these services. At the same time, is this still working? Okay. At the same time, because many of these children are released so quickly, it's often difficult to provide these services to them before they leave. When we see children initially in the shelters, they're incredibly shell-shocked from the journey that they've been through. And we need to give them several days to recover from their journeys, to begin to sort of assimilate into their new situation, and to feel comfortable enough to talk about what they experienced in their home country and what they experienced on the journey. So we need to give them that time. Now, at the same time, when they're in the custody of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, we also provide individual legal screening for the children to determine if they're eligible for any relief. The majority of the children we see, as has been discussed already, are fleeing extreme violence in their home country. Community violence from gangs, cartels,
participants on the call, including you. You are joining your conference as the host.
And also domestic violence and violence in the family. We've seen an increase in young children who are fleeing, young children who both have been targeted by the gangs at a younger and younger age for recruitment, and young children who are victims of violence within their own homes. We've also seen a significant increase in girls who are coming to the United States unaccompanied. Many of these girls have been fleeing sexual assault and rape or threats of sexual assault and rape from gang members who want the girls to be their girlfriends, and also from family members. We see a significant number of girls who have experienced sexual assault and rape from fathers, from uncles, from cousins within their families and are fleeing those types of harm. We've found that the children who receive information about their legal relief, who are told that they may be eligible for legal relief, are much more likely to seek legal services once they're released from custody and to continue with their court process. If they don't have that opportunity to learn information about what they may be eligible for, often they don't understand the need to pursue their case. And so it's incredibly important to provide that information to them. When the children are leaving here and then they're going to seek representation elsewhere, one thing that has been very difficult, as I mentioned, was their ability to try to access counsel, access representation so that they can go through the process. At the same time, the law right now is incredibly difficult for these children. The type of relief that these children seek, primarily asylum and special immigrant juvenile status, are both incredibly complex. Asylum law has grown very, very complicated in recent years. It varies tremendously depending on which jurisdiction you're in, whether you live in California or Illinois or Florida. And the ability of a child to understand what the law currently is, to be determined that they are a refugee, or to provide the necessary evidence and proof for the judge is incredibly difficult without an attorney to assist them. At the same time, children who are seeking special immigrant juvenile status, which is a form of relief for children who have been abused, abandoned, or neglected by one or both parents, they need to go to state court before they can even go to immigration court. So they actually go through two separate legal processes before they're able to obtain relief. So if you imagine a child without an attorney who does not speak English and does not have a clear understanding of the process, it's impossible for someone like that to be able to navigate the system. Recent data has shown that only 1 in 10 children who go to court without representation are able to be successful in their case. Quite frankly, I'm shocked at that number because I think it's impossible for me to see how any child would be able to successfully navigate the system, as complicated as it is, without an attorney. At the same time, these same reports have shown that if a child has an attorney, 7 in 10 of those children are able to be successful in their cases, and also that children who have attorneys are much more likely to appear in court. Immigration judges at the same time have said that they much prefer children to have representation in immigration court because it makes their process much simpler and it makes it much more efficient for them. Throughout all of this, one thing that's the most important is for children to have the time to find an attorney and develop trust with their attorney, develop rapport so that they can reveal the very traumatic incidents of their past and of their journey. As you may have seen in the news, some of the legislation that has been proposed to, quote unquote, deal with this current influx has purported to eliminate some of the protections that children currently have. So, for example, to treat all unaccompanied children the way Mexican children are treated, by which they either need to state their fear of return immediately at the border to the same person who just apprehended them, or they are returned to their home country. As we and many of you who work with these children have seen time and time again, it takes so much time for these children to be able to reveal some of the most traumatic and intimate details of their history. And to expect a child to do that within a week of crossing the border to Customs and Border Protection, or even to an immigration judge before they have had time to recover, talk to family, find representation, is simply not reasonable. And we believe very strongly that any change in the law that would take away those due process protections is only going to result in the U.S. returning bona fide refugees, returning child asylum seekers to countries where they will be persecuted and tortured. So right now, one of the most important things that we think needs to happen across the board is education about this issue, that these children, despite what some media may be portraying, are ultimately refugees and are eligible for protection in our country. They need to have the time and the resources to seek that protection so that they are not returned to countries where they will be persecuted, harmed, or abused. And we depend heavily on the legal resources for the children when they are released, because children are being released so quickly now, and there's no longer a guarantee that children are going to be able to access all the legal services they need while they are in the shelters, particularly, as Mary Meg mentioned, in some of these emergency shelters. While the majority of the shelters in the past were contracted with legal services to provide these Know Your Rights screenings and these legal screenings, Lackland Air Force Base, Fort Sill, Ventura are not necessarily receiving full legal services. There are also new transition shelters down near the border in Texas to also expedite the processing of these children, and there are not necessarily legal service providers that are contracted to serve these children. So many of these children are being released to family with no understanding that they are in immigration court proceedings, that they may be eligible for relief, and what they need to do to follow the process. So representation is crucial, and until appointed counsel is made available for these children, we believe it's going to be difficult for both the immigration court system and the children themselves to actually seek relief and continue to have an effective and efficient system.
Now what we wanted to do, can people hear, is just provide you with some ideas of what you could do in terms of next steps in response to what I would really call now. I began talking about a refugee crisis, but I really think the crisis is in Central America, and yes, we have a refugee emergency, but we can respond to that. It's not overwhelming. And so as Ashley mentioned, and as many of you may know, today Congress is their last day in session. We'll be voting on the President's request for some supplemental funding. What we've seen in some of the legislation that has been introduced is a real effort to roll back some of these due process protections for the children. Our sense from our colleague in D.C., and Jennifer Chan is here, our Associate Director of Policy, who could add more information, is that most likely nothing will pass today because we have two different bills and a lot of different bills going both in the House and the Senate, so that for something to really finally come out will most likely not happen in terms of a law. But what we're going to see is, I think, in September, when they come back, is the possibility of some of these very harsh bills being discussed again. So what we'd like to invite you to do in terms of advocacy and public education is to educate the public, to educate your communities, your colleagues in the legal profession and the faith-based organizations, your book clubs, but to really take some time to talk about what this issue is and why it's so important for children to have due process and access to counsel. I think Ashley mentioned, what we've been working on for years is appointed counsel for children. To think that a child could go in front of an immigration judge with a government attorney prosecuting the child and meaningfully have a day in court is ridiculous. And our laws do provide, when someone comes to our shores seeking protection, for due process, and that would not be due process. So we encourage you to be involved, to be engaged, to stay aware of the issue. We also have a great communications team and are always looking for people who would be interested in writing letters to the editor or op-eds. Again, just to educate people, because I think the narrative out there is not a good one, and each one of us have that option and that opportunity to engage people, to look at this in a different light.
Yeah, and if I can jump in and make kind of two plugs on that front and the advocacy front. So first of all, what Mary Meg, Ashley, and Trinidad all mentioned was education factor. I mean, I know we've got different people here, litigators, we've got policy, legislators, and we've also got people influential in the court of public opinion. When it comes to education, if you're looking for facts to help educate people, we've provided you some right here in this packet that you have, and most of this is available on NIJC's website. But there really are some good nuggets here, and these are all with citations to help people change the narrative. And let me just give you one example, and I think part of the fundamental narrative is really understanding whether people are coming here. There's a lot of discussion of whether they're doing it for deferred action, and it's a complicated mix of reasons of why we have the influx. But there also is the fact that people need to understand there really is a fleeing from danger aspect. And one of the more interesting bullet points I saw in here that helps you understand that people are really fleeing from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, not just for the United States. They're fleeing those countries specifically. So one of the good bullet points, talking points, from 2008 to 2013, the UN Refugee Agency documented a 712% increase in the number of asylum applications in Mexico, Panama, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Belize from nationals from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Okay, they're not just coming here because of changing immigration laws or potentially changing immigration laws. They're fleeing violence, they're fleeing danger. That's an important talking point. that will help change the narrative. Second plug I want to make is we do have a lot of people that do pro bono with NIJC. This influx is creating a strain on resources, and for lots of other organizations that do great immigrant resources. And so if you can get involved, and not just necessarily with the children, sometimes those cases are very difficult and have specific requirements, but maybe you can take a case, one of their not standard, but one of the adult cases, one of the ones, there's an increase of people seeking asylum from Congo and from Congo-Brazzaville specifically. Taking those cases will help increase bandwidth for NIJC and other organizations to do more for the influx of children.
And to add on to Wade's point, as I mentioned before, so we see many detained children here in Chicago, but most of those children do not stay here. And Illinois is not one of the top 10 receiving states for released children. So although we have seen an increase in unaccompanied children who need representation post-release, it's still not an incredibly high number here in Chicago. And so one of our biggest pro bono needs right now is not for children in their asylum cases, but for adults and families who are seeking asylum from Central America. And then for the children, there's often a significant need for actually attorneys with family law experience, specifically outside of Cook County. In order to be eligible for special immigrant juvenile status, as I mentioned before, children first need to get an order from a family court, typically probate or family court, that finds that they have been abused, abandoned, or neglected, and then are in the custody of a parent or a guardian. And that's something that we are often in need of referrals for, particularly, again, for children who live outside of Cook County. So any individuals that you may know, or if you practice any family law yourself, we're always looking for additional referrals that we can give to children and their families, because we can't help them on the immigration piece until they actually first go and obtain that state court piece.
So
I might just add one more thing. As I said initially, we've been seeing this trend, and we've been talking to the White House, the Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of State. So to go to Trini's point and presentation, we've really been encouraging the Department of State to begin to look at this issue so that people don't have to flee their countries. I've had clients who've gone back home once the situation stabilized. Individuals don't necessarily want to live in the United States, and I think there's this misperception in the community that everyone wants the dream, and oftentimes it's not a dream. They don't speak the language, they don't have their family, their culture, their professional colleagues, and so I think that's a really important piece to this that we need to encourage our government to address the root causes. And we are very fortunate to have Trini with us today. I failed in my introduction to give a little background about Trini besides saying he just came back from Honduras, but he is currently the Director of Community Relations at Maryville Academy. And prior to that time, he was the CEO of Counsel, which was a cooperative that worked with Honduran farmers in developing a network, a alternative marketing program. So I think addressing the root causes is critical to the situation.
Last week we had a big meeting in Cihuatepec in the central region in Honduras with farmers. And all of them say, we don't want to go to the States. It's an obligated situation that people are fleeing, but people want to improve the conditions in there, to make the way of life in there, because they remember how it was before, and even being poor but being okay, having the basic needs, and that's what they want to have. So I see two fronts in this working here. One is we have to give a good treatment to these children that are here in the state now. We have to treat them as human beings and to give all their children rights. And but in the second front is to stop the immigration by constructing a new way for life over there. And I said that's the basic problem. I talked to a lot of young people, and they said, listen, I have two options in here. I can go and work in the maquila. You know what's maquila? How do you translate that?
The factories.
I can go and work in maquila, earning, that will be like $30, $40 per month, 300, no, per week, that's per week, yes. And then the other new job opening, big job opening, is the Army. The Army is offering 6,000 lamps, which will be like $200, which is a good income for a family, $200 in there, to go to be a soldier in the Army. But they say they are recruiting all those youth who are from the National Party. The National is a conservative party, it's in power now, and those can become in the Army and then have the salary. You know, the United States is, in the last 4 years, have built 4 military bases in Honduras. You know that. We have had a Palmerola base since 20 years ago, but now after the coup in Honduras, 3 more bases, the military bases are there. So when people say, we don't want that kind of aid, we want another kind to construct economic development through creation of jobs and empowering people to create their own way of life. We don't want more military, more guns. The country is full of guns. It's all the guns made in the United States. Who started putting a lot of guns in Honduras was President Reagan. He was supporting the Contra from Nicaragua and gave a lot of guns to them. When the war ended, all those guns were sold for $10, $20 to buy corn and beans and to buy other things that the family need. So there is a lot of guns in that society. This is very armed society. So I think Central America needs a very deep process of disarmament, demilitarization, go back to the civil society, to a really through process of elections, and respect the willing of the people in terms of democratic terms. So in the United States have a big role to help us in that. But we don't want more military aid. That's a big mistake. And another mistake is to those free trade agreements that favor the big companies are free investment, are no free trade, because we don't have, we are not exporters, big exporters. They see us as consumers, and also they want to invest. That's the only thing. But the kind of investment that it's doing now is exploring mines, exploring the water, the coast and north coast and the south coast, shrimps, and those are good things, and the tilapias are coming from there too. But we need other kind of investment that will empower people to reconstruct their way of life in there.
Thank you. And like I said, we're going to try to end as promptly as possible. It's 9:35, but I do encourage people to stick around, coordinate. Obviously, there's some good people here who have some good ideas. There's also a sign-in sheet. If you want to put your email on there, we'll make sure to blast out Rebecca's website information and also links to all the talking points in here. Thank you, everyone, and thanks to the panel of experts.